We scaled BottleKeeper to over 60 million in total revenue with no investors, no outside capital. Then we sold it to private equity when we had a grand total of 6 people. That was including my co-founder, Matt, and I. And the thing is, the way that we built that company is entirely replicable. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how we did it. Most people who heard our story assume that we got lucky, it was an overnight success, or that Shark Tank was the reason it all worked. And look, Shark Tank really did help, but we were already a $10 million a year business when we went on that show. The real reason that we were able to scale the way we did and stay lean and remain profitable and eventually sell to private equities was because of a very specific set of strategies that I am going to share with you in this video. I will cover everything you need in order to predictably scale an e-commerce business to over 10 million a year in revenue based on all the trials and tribulations and blood and sweat and tears that we went through over the course of building that brand for nearly a decade. Let's get into it. There are 2 sides to every e-commerce business, and in most companies, they operate like 2 entirely different silos or separate departments within a company. There is the finance side, which shows you how the business spends money. It shows you how the business earns money. And then there's the marketing and customer acquisition side. This is how they drive the revenue inside the business, the things that they do to actively make more sales. The problem is that every decision that is made on one side directly affects the other. And when they're not connected, you end up making marketing decisions without any financial context, and you end up making financial decisions with no marketing context. They speak entirely different languages. Now, to be clear, this is not just a small business problem. I have personally seen inside of $50 million a year companies that have a full-time CFO and a full-time CMO, and those 2 people, they genuinely, they don't speak the same language. Finance is telling marketing that they need to generate more revenue with less ad spend, and marketing is telling finance that they need more budget to hit their revenue targets. Now, neither side is wrong. They just don't have shared information to explain their position to each other and get on the same page. So they end up fighting and arguing, nothing gets solved, and the business suffers for it. And when you're running the business yourself, like we were early on at BottleKeeper, you have the same disconnected challenges. They just live inside your own head or inside your small team. So if you don't have an understanding, a working understanding of how expenses function inside of a business, how you are making financial decisions that drive marketing, and how you're making marketing decisions that drive finance, you're in the exact same position. The result is that you end up setting ad budgets based on what feel comfortable, what is capital you're willing to risk, instead of what the business actually needs to hit your revenue and profit targets. So we run discounts thinking it's going to drive more volume without knowing how quietly disrupting your margin structure is incredibly impactful negatively on the business. You run a discount because you think it will drive more volume while not knowing that you're changing your margin structure in a way that is absolutely crushing profitability. Or you hire somebody because it feels like the right move. You think you're going to grow into that position and you need this person to help you continue to grow without knowing how marketing and the performance inside of marketing needs to change or adjust or improve in order to pay for the cost of that person, of the decision to hire that person. So these are just a couple of examples of how the financial side of the business and the marketing side of the business are just entirely disconnected. And that's where all the good stuff is. That's where the opportunity lies. So month to month, you end up making decisions. You wait weeks for your profit and loss statement, whether your accountants do it, your bookkeeper, or you're doing it yourself. And you find out way after the fact whether those decisions were helpful or hurtful. And you can't pull it back because the thing's already happened. So you only see it after the numbers come in and the damage is already done. Now, to be clear, the brands that get past 10 million a year into the 8 figures, they're not always the ones, they're not generally the ones that have the most epic creative or the lowest cost per click or the best click-through rates. They're the ones that have figured out or started to understand the math that connects the finance side and the marketing side of the business. So they're making smarter and more confident decisions about how they operate both in real time. The result is that it's producing more revenue, more profitable revenue as the output. That means that they know what their ad budgets need to produce before they set them. They know what discounts do to margins before they run them. They know how performance needs to change for that to not be a disaster. They know the one metric that tells you whether or not your business is working and these decisions are net positive or net negative. Once you have all of that, every decision in the business becomes dramatically easier. They become no-brainers. All you have to do is take the right actions to get the right results. Before we get into the numbers, I want to give you a visual for where your time and energy actually belong in your business. I call this the profit pyramid. So in our profit pyramid, there are 3 parts. The bottom part is how the business makes money. This is finance. This is where all our margins live, all our expenses live, all our payroll, our healthcare, the revenue that comes into the business, which creates the margins against our sales related expenses. It lives here in the bottom. This is the foundation of our pyramid. In the middle, here are output metrics that come from activities like AOV, conversion rate, LTV, customer acquisition cost, these mission critical metrics. Now, these are output metrics. These are things that happen as a result of decisions we make inside the business. Then at the top here are eyeballs. These are the things that we spend a lot of time arguing with marketing agencies about, things like click-through rate, impressions, bounce rates, trying to go viral, doing all the things in order to get as many eyeballs as humanly possible. Now, the reality is all of the money lives in the bottom of this pyramid. So the further we go up this pyramid, the less impact these things have on our net profit, okay? But in reality, from a time consumption standpoint, we spend most of our time up here and less of our time down here. This is an inverse relationship. We spend most of our time up here in the top of the pyramid doing this activity when the stuff below this top of the pyramid, this middle, most importantly, this base level component of the pyramid is broken. So we can be the best marketing team in the world. We can be crushing marketing, going viral constantly, and the business can still be losing money. And the reason for that is because the things below this top of the pyramid, this impression part of the pyramid, the eyeballs part of the pyramid, are broken. So what we need to do is we need to invert how we think about this. If we focus first on understanding how the business needs to operate in order to make money, these things that exist down here in the finance bottom part of this pyramid, the foundation of the pyramid, everything that happens as we move up this pyramid gets more effective. It gets easier. It gets more powerful. The second piece of that pyramid, focusing on things like average order value, conversion rate, lifetime value, customer acquisition cost. These are absolutely mission critical. I'm not saying that this is not important. It is important, but it matters a heck of a lot less if the stuff below all those impressions on the pyramid are broken. So we need to invert the way that we think about spending time. And first, let's fix these things. Let's get an understanding of what we can do to pull levers better and smarter in the finance, revenue, margin, expense part of the business. And we don't have to do these things like completely linear one after another. They can happen at the same time. And then let's go and find ways to increase and impact our conversion rate, deal with average order value, improving lifetime value, bringing customer acquisition costs down. Something we can do that really dramatically impacts this middle piece that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about is pricing. Has a really heavy impact on what happens in this middle part of the pyramid. And then from a time consumption standpoint, focusing on getting eyeballs onto the system. Because again, in reality, if this bottom piece is worked out and this is operating at least reasonably well, this doesn't need to hit a home run every single time. How we acquire customers and what we spend to acquire customers to get more eyeballs into the business can perform worse, and we can still be profitable because the things that are happening below this are functioning at a much, much, much higher, healthier capacity. Now that you understand why the financial foundation matters, it's absolutely critical, let's actually build it and look at it in its full form and glory. The place to start is understanding that not all expenses impact your business the same. This is what I call the 4 pillars of profit. Now, they behave differently because they hit the business differently. And if you treat them all the exact same, you'll end up with a really, really fuzzy picture of what's happening inside the company. So in these 4 pillars, once you understand them, everything else starts to click into place. The first bucket is revenue. It's the money that's coming in. Now, we're not talking yet about how you earn the revenue and the advertising and all that stuff. We're just talking about the actual revenue. We need that because it is a critical piece of understanding a couple of these other buckets and how they impact the business. The second absolutely critical pillar is your fixed expenses. This is where a lot of early stage companies really get into trouble. Fixed expenses are the ones that exist whether or not you make money. These are operating expenses, things like payroll, rent, health insurance, software subscriptions, legal and accounting fees. If your revenue goes up, if it goes from $1,000 to $3,000, generally your fixed expenses don't change. Now they can change a little bit every month, but they're not tied to revenue. So they don't change unless you intentionally change them. Again, an important clarification is that the word fixed doesn't mean they don't change. I'm going to reiterate this because it's important. Your legal fees are fixed. They're operating expenses, but one month it might be $100. The next month it might be $5,000, but they are not tied to sales. So we do not consider them a sales related expense. And the thing about these fixed expenses is that they don't care whether you've had a good month or a bad month, whether your sales go up or whether your sales go down. They just sit there like dead weight in the middle of your boat waiting to get paid. What happens in an early stage company is that we start to generate some revenue and think that we need to hire people in order to sustain it. So we add a bunch of payroll and we don't understand how everything else needs to change to pay for it. So we literally just add weight to the business, and that slows everything down. The third pillar of profit are your variable expenses. These are expenses that are directly tied to sales. Think of cost of goods sold, shipping and fulfillment to the customer, credit card fees, Shopify fees, Amazon fees, all the stuff that you pay when you sell a product. If you sell 3 times the amount of product in a given week, these expenses generally increase at a similar rate. We look at these in the context of margin. That's why the revenue part is really important. We want to take the revenue compared to those expenses. It becomes a critical metric inside of our business. In fact, it's such a critical metric that when we convert this into a margin, it is one of the leading indicators as to the efficiency of the business. It dictates what ROAS needs to be to get to break even, how much ad budget requires a certain amount of performance to create a net profit outcome. This is all tied into your variable expenses. Now, the fourth pillar of profit is advertising dollars. Now, let's be clear. Advertising is a variable expense. Your accountant will call it a variable expense. It goes on your P&L as a variable expense. But we are going to look at this information differently because your accountant doesn't know how to run your business. So advertising in this context means paid ads, things that we can ramp up or down quickly. Think within 24 hours. This is Meta, Google Ads, TikTok, Amazon Ads, Pinterest, all the places where you're spending digitally online that we can ramp up or down. This does not include influencer or affiliate campaigns, buying bus benches and media, magazine articles, things like that. Those are variable costs. They're sales related, but we can't ramp them up or down quickly. So we don't want to think of them as like fuel for the engine that is your business. Now, understanding why these 4 separate pillars are extremely important completely changes the way that the business operates and the way that we think about driving profitable revenue. So once you understand that fixed expenses, they just sit in the business regardless of revenue, that's how you treat your overhead and hiring decisions. We need to think about that completely differently. Once you understand that advertising is fuel for the business and not just an expense or cost in the P&L, we can create clarity using math to get you a lot more comfortable about how you use that ad budget to drive a profitable outcome. Now, there is a specific metric inside of every company on the planet that answers critically important questions inside your business that we can now get to having an understanding of the different types of expenses. This metric is called contribution profit. Now, mathematically speaking, contribution profit is your revenue minus the variable expenses. That includes advertising. So, for example, if you do $5,000 in revenue in a given week, your variable expenses total up to $3,000. Your contribution profit is $2,000. That is what's left to contribute to the business and pay for the operating expenses. And net profit, which is the number that we actually care about at the end of the day, is equal to the contribution profit minus the fixed expenses. So if that same business has $1,500 in fixed expenses for the week, then they walk away with $500 in net profit. It's the contribution profit minus the fixed expenses. But if they have $2,800 in fixed expenses, they actually lose $800. That's a negative net profit. So the profitability equation is not complex. There is no calculus. It's literally subtraction. But the real reason contribution profit completely changes how we operate our business is based on what it tells you over time. If you're wondering if the new marketing agency is doing well, if the new campaigns, if the new pricing structure that you increased or decreased, discounts, whatever it is, if you're wondering if they're working, you look at your contribution profit on a chart and you graph it over time. We want to see that it's trending up. If the trend line is going up, it's working. It's adding positive contribution profit to the business. If it's going down, it's not working. It's actually taking contribution profit away from the business. So again, if you're testing free shipping and you want to know whether or not it's helping or hurting, look at your contribution profit over time. It will answer the question. By the way, if you want to see how all of this is tracked automatically for your business, this is exactly what Pentane was built to do. It connects QuickBooks and your accounting system to your revenue and your ad platforms, and it just calculates the things and gives you the answer to the question. Pulls things like contribution profit in real time, shows you the trend line, shows you what's happening, allows you to put specific actions and dates into the system to make it real clear. So you can try it out for yourself by clicking the first link in the description. Now, at BottleKeeper, our business was incredibly cyclical. We would lose money in Q1 every single year. We would spend the entire quarter just trying to figure out how to lose as little money as possible, like stem the bleeding. We would make money in Q2, largely because of Father's Day and summer coming up. We were a really summer heavy product. We would do mediocre in Q3, lose a little bit of money, but not terrible. And then we would literally do half our revenue in the last 6 weeks of Q4. So we had to hit a grand slam every single year to make the year. What kept us sane was being able to understand our contribution profit as a leading indicator and make decisions around. So as we were coming into those slow periods, we could see crystal clear when we needed to start pulling things back to conserve inventory, create more efficiency, and when we were coming into a new period, when we should surge our ad spend and exactly how it needed to perform to create our profit outcomes that we had to have in the business. Because again, we had no investors, we didn't want to get them. So now that we've set the framework, set the stage, and we have this critical metric, contribution profit, let's talk about what we can actually do to move that number, to improve it. Now, there are 5 levers that we can pull to move net profit in a meaningful way, and we're gonna start at the top of the list. The first is product pricing, and this is particularly important if you have a high variable margin. Product pricing is one of the highest impact levers that you can pull inside of the entire business. It's not ad creative, conversion rate optimization, lifetime value, all that stuff is important, but pricing is one of the first things that we should look at. And the reason is that it impacts your variable margin, which is the percent of every dollar you spend to earn that dollar. These are the sales related expenses like cost of goods and shipping and fulfillment and those things we talked about earlier. Now, a small move in variable margin down creates a disproportionately large move in your capacity to earn contribution profit and thus net profit. So let me show you an actual example of what this looks like. Let's take a business with $200,000 per month in fixed expenses. They're operating at a 90% variable margin. That includes the advertising. This means that 90 cents of every dollar they earn goes towards those sales related expenses. So only 10 cents of every dollar reaches contribution profit. At 10 cents per dollar or a 10% contribution margin, they need to generate $2 million in revenue just to get to break even. That exact same business, if they increase their prices just 10%, the variable margin drops from 90% to 82%. Their contribution margin, the result of that change, increases from 10% to 18%. That's an 80% increase in every dollar earned that flows through to contribution profit. Now, that exact same company can hit their profit target of getting to break even at $1.38 million instead of $2 million because of a 10% price increase. If they keep revenue at $2 million, they generate $250,000 in net profit instead of zero. Now, the reaction that most people have to this is an absolutely visceral one, and I understand it. We are emotional humans. That's a part of the human experience. We feel like raising prices is going to hurt the conversion rate and our customers are going to get angry and that we're going to sell a ton less product. And maybe that's true and maybe it's not. I'll give you a really specific example of changing prices when those things didn't happen. At BottleKeeper, we started at a $20 price point. I thought that felt really expensive. That was my emotional response to it. But I also am relatively scientifically minded. So we started testing. And over the course of 2 years, we added some things to the product, like a 10-cent tether. We turned the lid into a bottle opener. We added some powder coating, things that were really inexpensive to add. Now, over the course of 2 years, with those additions, we tested that product up to $40 price point. Our conversion rate, it didn't tank. Our customers, they didn't get angry. The reality is, unless your customer base is returning at an incredibly high rate, you're in a subscription business, that's a totally different world. We had a 15% return customer rate, which meant 85% of the people buying our product had never seen the price before. So we let the data answer the question on what the market would pay for the product. We tried to completely eliminate all of the gut feeling and guessing that we were doing. So the only real way to know what your market will accept for your product is to test it. So I'm always going to suggest that you test your product prices up. You can do it incrementally. I wouldn't double your prices overnight. We did it over the course of 2 years, but test your prices up 5, 10, 20% and watch the conversion rate. See what happens. If your conversion rate holds, exceptional. But even if it drops, that might be okay because selling that product at that higher price point, if you take it from $20 to $25, there's no marginal impact. You don't pay, that 90% on the extra $5 of revenue. It's pure contribution profit. So in that case, a 25% decrease in performance and conversion rate is probably still net positive for that business. And if your conversion rate starts to drop, you at least now have the data to tell you by exactly how much it can drop and still be net positive. It might be a situation where that extra contribution profit being created by the increased price, conversion rate might be able to drop 10, 15, 20, 25%, and it's still be net positive to the business. It's adding more contribution profit because of that higher pricing. And guess what? You're selling less product, but it's more efficient. It's creating more contribution profit, which means you have a better outcome. You have more inventory. You worked less. That's incredible. That is a positive net outcome, despite the fact that our performance came down a little bit. But again, the key here is knowing where that guardrail is. The second lever is lifetime value and average order value. Now, LTV is how much a customer is going to spend over the entire life of your business. It's an output metric. It is the result of other decisions that you're making that directly impact this metric. And pricing is one of them. Higher prices means that each purchase contributes more to that 12-month cycle of lifetime value with the customer. Getting customers to come back for a second or third or fourth purchase obviously dramatically impacts that as well. And that's something that we constantly want to be trying to do. Average order value, also an output metric, is the average dollar value for each order, as it's described it. At BottleKeeper, we were super deliberate about how we used bundles, and this is where pricing and discounting things got interesting, to move as much value through a single order. So in our case, we would, for example, sell the first unit at full price. We'd sell a 2-pack for $75 instead of $80, and a 3-pack would bring the third unit down to a $30 price point. So we would test and mess with these things constantly. We did it in a really clean way, so we weren't mixing variables, but where we ended up generally became the permanent price structure as we sort of cycled through the life cycle of the product in the business. These are things that we would just test constantly. We would be tweaking prices up. We would be testing different bundles, different colors. This is part of the deal in working in a consumer brand. You're just going to test these things all the time. And then you find something that works and you stick with that for a while until you go and test it again. So another way is within the checkout, adding complementary products. There are boatloads of Shopify apps in the ecosystem that can help you do this. But again, both of these metrics, lifetime value and average order value, are metrics that directly feed your marketing efficiency. Higher AOV and LTV mean that the same ad dollar generates more revenue per customer over time. So this means that you can afford to acquire more customers at a higher cost and still be profitable. Your ROAS is actually going to increase as a result of improving these metrics. Now, our third big lever that we get to pull, which I just mentioned in the last piece, but we're going to get into in a lot more detail, is conversion rate. Now, conversion rate is the percent of visitors that visit your site that end up on your order confirmation page that actually buy a product. So if your conversion rate goes up, it improves. This means that the revenue driven by your existing ad spend and all your efforts across the business are increasing. The revenue is going up. It's literally linear. Conversion rate goes up 10%, revenue goes up 10%. So the way to think about conversion rate is that we have to be really disciplined about testing it. We need to test copy and images and button colors and layout and page flow and all of these things. But it's really, really important that we only test them one variable at a time, because if we change the headline and the button color at the same time, we're not really going to know what the customer is reacting with positively that incentivizes or disincentivizes an order. So the important piece here is if you're doing 3,000 visitors in a month, we really need to be careful about limiting the variables. If you're doing 30,000 visitors in a month through the website, you can do what's called multivariate testing, which any conversion rate optimization platform is going to allow you to do. Just know that the volume of traffic going through that test is critically important. And if you don't have enough of it, it's going to take forever to get to the point where you have any amount of what's called statistical significance to show whether that test was good or was it bad. Now, I'm going to add a caveat to lifetime value, and that is this concept of contribution profit lifetime value. That is the amount of contribution profit that is being driven by a customer over the lifetime of them buying products for your company. Now, lifetime value, like average order value, like conversion rate, like revenue, like net profit, every single one of these metrics becomes a vanity metric if you lose the context. Net profit, if you make $1 million in net profit, that sounds amazing unless you're doing $1 billion in revenue, and then it's horrific. Conversion rate, you're at a 10% conversion rate. 10% of the people that come through the site and order a product is incredible unless your business is doing $3,000 a year. Then it doesn't really mean anything. Every single one of these metrics can be used without context. Lifetime value is one of them. A $10,000 lifetime value in a customer. But if your variable margin, including your advertising spend, is 98%, you're literally generating $200 in contribution profit against that $10,000 lifetime value. It doesn't mean anything. So looking at the contribution profit lifetime value is a metric that is unbelievably important to be able to follow and track, which is really just the combination of the lifetime value of the customer times the contribution margin that's being driven throughout the business. Now, one last note on conversion rate that's really important before we go into our next lever. As conversion rate increases, there are costs associated to that additional revenue, because as your revenue increases, that variable margin, the percent of every dollar that you earn that goes towards cost of goods sold, shipping, fulfillment, credit card fees, all that stuff, that increases with the increase in revenue. So a 10% increase in conversion rate is not a 10% increase in contribution profit or net profit. It is a 10% increase in revenue that we then have to apply our variable margin or our variable expenses to that revenue in order to understand how much that additional revenue from the conversion rate increase is actually positively impacting the business. So there are other metrics inside of our business that don't have this same issue. Pricing is one of them. When we increase pricing, there's no real marginal impact on that additional revenue being earned by the pricing, unless we have to spend a ton more to acquire the customer in order to get them to convert at that higher price point. So really important note there for conversion rate. Let's go on to the fourth lever that we get to pull. This fourth lever is critically important, and it is an area that I see companies make mistakes an awful lot. And it's a lot of what Pentane is frankly built around. Most operators set their ad budgets based on what they feel comfortable spending, what they feel comfortable losing, and that is a huge problem. I have done this before, so I totally understand it. It's an emotional response to the risk associated with spending capital that you don't know how it needs to perform in order to do good. So ad budgets without any mathematical framework behind them, it feels like gambling, because honestly, it is just gambling. gambling. We're just sort of like putting money in and hoping and praying it works the way that we want it to. But in order for the business to function and produce contribution profit, and the result of which is to operate profitably, is incredibly dependent in this consumer world that we operate in on the amount of ad budget that we put into the business. So the correct way to think about ad budget is as a function of the contribution margin being produced by the revenue against the fixed expenses. That's where this really important space that answers the question, how much do we need to spend and how does it need to perform? So the specific return on ad spend that the business needs to hit a given net profit target goal on the back end changes as our ad budget changes. As our ad budget goes up, that needed return on ad spend decreases. It follows this really interesting curve called a negative log curve. That part's not important. Just know that as you increase ad budget, the needed return on ad spend to get to break even, to generate a 5 or 10 or 20% net profit margin, or to generate 5 or 10 or $25,000 in net profit, the needed return on ad spend to hit that goal comes down as our ad budget goes up. Now, like most things, we don't want to operate at the extremes. We can't just like juice our ad spend to infinity and take that ROAS to as low as humanly possible, because that's entirely unrealistic. The alternative, though, is if we only put in a tiny amount of ad budget, the needed return on ad spend to hit that break even or $25,000 a month net profit goal, whatever it is for you, might be 25, which is entirely unrealistic. So there's this middle space that we want to be really careful operating inside of and understanding how it works, so that the decisions that we make in and around ad budget creates an outcome that is realistic. That is a critically important piece of this. I'll give you a quick example of an actual business, how this would work. If we have a business that is spending $100,000 in fixed expenses, that's our operating expenses, payroll, healthcare, office, etc., and has a 50% variable margin without advertising. So that's cost of goods, shipping, fulfillment, credit card fees, but not including ad spend. If they set their ad budget at $10,000, this business needs to earn a 22 return on ad spend just to get to break even. We know it's not going to happen, so we got to get into reality. At a $50,000 ad budget, that same company needs a 6 return on ad spend to get to break even. At $100,000, that 6 becomes a 4 return on ad spend to get break even. So the budget, we can't look at it just purely as an expense or cost in the business. It's actually the fuel for the engine that is the business. And the more that we put in, the faster the engine gets to operate. And frankly, the less efficient it needs to be in order to create the outcome that we're trying to achieve. Now, the fifth really important lever, which I almost hesitate to call a lever, but I want to talk about it and I think it's really important. So we'll refer to it as a lever, because having some knowledge about this creates incredible clarity in how you build and operate a business. Attribution. I'm going to add into that marketing efficiency ratio, but attribution. Let me give you some history on attribution, which will help explain why looking at your platform level attribution data is nice. It's good to see, but you cannot take it seriously. So let's go back a bit in history. In 2016, I was personally spending over $1 million a year in ad budget. I was trying to understand how Meta, at the time was called Facebook, we were advertising on Instagram, we were advertising in Google Ads, we were testing anywhere that we could possibly figure out how to test, because we were at a place in the business where we could reinvest in advertising heavily. I wanted to understand how the dollar that we spent was returning to us. So I went deep down the rabbit hole of attribution. At that time, it was already really, really murky and gray for a couple of reasons. One is attribution windows. Now, without spending an entire hour talking about the perils of attribution windows, I'll just give you the high level. There are generally 2 different views that a platform like Meta will take on attribution: a view-through window and a click-through window. Back then, their inherent settings were 30 days for view-through and click-through. That means that anytime someone viewed a Facebook ad and ended up on BottleKeeper's website and made it through a transaction, if they just had in their feed on Facebook, they didn't interact with it, they didn't click on it, they literally just could have scrolled right past it, but it was shown to them within the last 30 days. So 28 days later, 4 weeks, Facebook will take credit for that. And that will draw down the cost per acquisition and draw up the platform ROAS and all the associated metrics out of Facebook. Well, they also saw an ad on Google in that 28-day period. So Google also takes credit for that and draws down the cost per acquisition that they're reporting to you and draws up the ROAS. And so did, let's say, Pinterest. All of the platforms had their pixels, which is just a little tiny script that lives on our website. They knew that Susie saw an ad on Facebook or Google or Pinterest, those individual platforms. Then they now got pinged that Susie made a purchase on BottleKeeper's website. And so they all take credit for it, which completely draws down your cost per acquisition. So, which is completely unrealistic. So I made this huge mistake. It cost $500,000 over the course of about 16 months. I went and heavily then invested over the top of what the attribution metrics coming out of the platforms were saying. The result of which is at the end of a couple of months, what the P&L said and what our data inside of Pentane said was wildly different than what was being reported into the individual platforms. And it's because these attribution windows were so big and every single one of the platforms was taking credit for it, which just unreasonably draws down all of that attribution metric data. So it was already hard and really difficult to try to manage 10 years ago. Then in about 2020, Apple launched iOS 14.5. And what they did in that is they blocked the pixels. Like, let that sink in for a second. They blocked the pixels. 80% of your website traffic right now, generally speaking, is iPhone. Those pixels that Meta and Google and Pinterest and TikTok and all the platforms that they used to get when someone would come to your website or my website, BottleKeeper at the time, that pixel traffic now doesn't get back to Meta. It gets blocked because it's a security setting inside of iOS after 14.5. So Facebook doesn't know that that person made the purchase. Instagram doesn't know that person made the purchase the tremendous majority of the time. Google doesn't know that person made the purchase. TikTok doesn't know that person made the purchase. So the platform attribution data that ends up inside Meta and Google and TikTok, and pick one, it is best guess data. You cannot look at it like it's real, because it is not. Use it as a baseline. For example, if your platform level ROAS inside of Meta is 1.5 over a month, and then it goes to 2, I would look at that loosely as a 33% increase in performance on Facebook. If it goes from 1.5 down to 1, I would look at that as a 33% decrease in performance. Okay. So understand that, look at it as baseline, but you cannot look at the platform level ROAS like it's real, like it's actually what's happening, and make decisions around ad budget on that. Instead, what you need to look at is a metric that at BottleKeeper we call global return on ad spend. And then some Yahoo made up this fancy marketing metric called marketing efficiency ratio, your total revenue divided by your ad spend. That's what matters. If the ad spend is being productive, and you have to think of this in the context of how much of your business is direct to consumer versus wholesale. I'll tell you how I looked at it in our business at BottleKeeper. But the marketing efficiency ratio, looking at that change over time, is a much, much better, more useful, less complex answer to the question, is the ad budget adding additional revenue into the business, or is it taking a revenue away from the business? Are we decreasing our revenue as a result of that? Now, the difference, as I mentioned, with D2C and B2B revenue that comes out of ad spend in BottleKeeper, and every business is a little bit different. So take this just as a single example. In BottleKeeper, our product, we were highly confident, we saw this in the data over time, that as we went into the wholesale arena, the people that saw our product on a shelf and knew what it was and now had a place they could buy it in person, they knew what that thing was and were exposed to it because of ad budget that was being spent on Facebook and Instagram and all these other places. So that's why we looked at global return on ad spend, or MER, which is the same thing. We were able to see how the ad spend that we were spending floated both of those channels. Now, we also looked at it individually on just a direct consumer return on ad spend standpoint. And these are metrics that all live inside of Pentane. Just your direct to consumer revenue, including Amazon, that's really important. Your direct to consumer revenue divided by your ad spend, critically important. That's a much closer loop, because as you're spending to acquire customers online, it's going to more immediately directly impact your direct to consumer revenue. And some percent of that, high percent, if you're selling on Amazon, are going to end up on Amazon. So let's not pretend that that's its own platform or ecosystem. It is with respect to advertising with Amazon ads, but some percent of your customers are going to see your ad and just go buy it on Amazon. So we need those things to be in the same bucket. But looking at your MER, your direct to consumer return on ad spend, just your direct to consumer revenue divided by your ad spend, in addition to your total revenue divided by your ad spend, those are much better indicators as to the marketing efficiency, the returns that are happening on that ad spend within the business. So just be extremely careful taking the performance level data that requires information from your website to go back to the platform to work, like cost per acquisition, return on ad spend, customer acquisition cost, things like that. Click-through rates, impressions, that's totally different. That happens inside their platform. They know exactly what's happening with that, but really important distinction there. Now, just as important as knowing what to do is knowing what not to do. So let's have a look at 3 mistakes that take brands completely out of the game before they even have the capacity to reach their potential. The first mistake, which I already covered, but I'm going to cover it again because it's so important, is making up your ad budget. This happens because we end up setting the ad budget based on what feels comfortable, what we're willing to lose, what we're willing to risk, instead of doing it in a way that is built on the math inside the company, how the business spends and makes money. So I know we already covered the math in the lever section, but here's what actually happens when it doesn't get done. You hand a marketing team a budget that's mathematically incompatible with the goal. It's literally literally just a chunk of money with a hope and a prayer that it works. And then you try to hold the marketing agency or team accountable for the result. But the reality is the underlying math, which we didn't really understand, required the company to hit a 22 return on ad spend to get to break even. And so the marketing team, they crush a 4 and they're stoked, but you hemorrhage money. Everybody's mad. Marketing team doesn't know why. You don't know why. From your perspective, which again, I totally understand, the marketing team is underperforming. From the marketing team's perspective, they did a great job and they don't understand what happened. So the reality is the entire infrastructure was just set up for failure. And then what tends to happen is we either immediately fire the agency or we pull back on the budget, which makes it harder. It actually makes the systems worse. Then this cycle, it repeats. We just then we go to the next marketing agency and we haven't fixed the underlying problem with the math. So the fix is this: we have to be able to calculate break-even return on ad spend based on the ad budget, not after the campaigns run, not after the fact. We need to do this going into it. We need to understand the amount of fixed expenses that are in the business. We need to understand the variable margin that's in the business. And we need to work backwards from those numbers, the amount of revenue that we need to hit in order to create enough contribution profit in order to pay for the fixed expenses. And then we back that into what's the ad budget remainder against that revenue to create the ROAS. And again, like Pentane does all this stuff, but if you want to do it yourself, there is some complexity in doing this. And as you try to look at it on a scale of increasing ad budget dynamically to see that dynamic reduction in return on ad spend, there's some relatively complex math in there on how to do that. That being said, the total resulting revenue that you need to drive enough contribution profit to pay for your fixed expenses. Okay. So again, we have to be careful with how we set our ad budgets and do it in a way that has completely unemotional. There's no emotion involved. Our second huge mistake is running discounts on the business without understanding how they need to perform to not be a disaster. And this is one of the absolutely most common ways that I see e-commerce brands unknowingly destroy their capacity for profit or their contribution profit, which is where profit comes from. We do it like this. We run a sale. We sort of make the number up. It's 10%, it's 15%, it's 20%. Traffic increases, conversion rate goes up, and the revenue line looks positive, but the P&L comes back 6 weeks later and it was horrific. We actually made less money than before when we were running the discount. So this is what actually happens when you run a discount inside of a business. Your variable costs, the variable expenses related to sales, they don't change. It's just the price that you're driving against that changes. So you compress that contribution margin in between those two things. What that means is that if you're spending the same amount of marketing dollar, it needs to perform significantly higher in order to make up that difference, to allow for there to still be space in between what you're earning in revenue and what you're spending on your sales related expenses and advertising. As an example, let's take a business that has a 50% variable margin without advertising and $100,000 in ad budget. At that setup, their break-even return on ad spend is 2. Now, they're not paying for fixed expenses. This is just the how much do they need to earn in order to not be losing money on every order. If that business runs a 10% discount, their variable margin climbs from 50% to 56% because the cost didn't change, but the revenue on each order dropped, and that pushes the break-even ROAS from 2 to 2.3. So if their actual ROAS comes in at 2.15, they think that might be good. That's almost a 10% increase in performance. They're actually losing money on every order, despite the fact that on the surface, it looks like it's probably better. If they push that further into a 20% discount, now that variable margin goes from 50% to 63%. And the break-even ROAS on that climbs to 2.7. At a 30% discount, variable margin jumps to 71%, way past the danger zone of 60-ish%. And for that business, they have to be at a 3.45 return on ad spend just to get to break even. Again, not break even on the business, break even on the order. So they're not spending more than the dollar to earn the dollar. Now, the assumption behind every discount that we do is that conversion rate will improve to compensate for that discount. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. The kicker though is we have to know before we go and run it so we can create the guardrail. We can create the limit to that. So we know anything above this number, good. Anything below this number, bad. This is how we get to the point where we're not being surprised by our P&L, is by being able to use the math, not the emotion, but the math to answer the questions before we go and do it and understand where our limits are. So if you go and execute that 10% discount and you know you need to be at a 4.2 return on ad spend for this to be positive for the business, and over the course of 2 weeks, you're at a 3.9, turn it off, stop it. Like, you have the ability then to take that information and do a test. There's always going to be some risk with a test, but be able to know in real time whether the thing is working or not. So to tie these together, if the math says you need a 50% increase in return on ad spend, it goes from 3 to 4.5 just to get to break even. That also means that your site conversion rate needs to go from 2 to 3. It has to have the same amount of increase in order to not lose money, to not generate less contribution profit than before you had the discount. And obviously, as we get into discounting periods like Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and the holidays, critically important to know these going into that, because I cannot tell you the number of times I have heard from clients that come into Pentane in January, when they find out in January that all the discounts and things that they did that looked awesome on the revenue side, they actually made less money in Q4 than had they not been running the discount. Super important to know that going into it so you can make the changes and prepare for it while it's happening, not after it has already happened and we're now into Q1, which is a much slower period. Now, our third big mistake here is adding fixed expenses without understanding the consequences, without understanding how the business needs to either increase revenue, increase ad budget, how the performance needs to change in order to pay for those fixed expenses. Now, these are things generally payroll. That's a huge one. Offices, fancy office expenses, huge legal bills, all these fixed expenses that exist whether or not we make money. And I'm not saying you shouldn't hire people. That's a decision that is entirely up to you, because at some point you may have to. I had to at BottleKeeper. It got way too big to not have people in the 4th year of operation. But as you add fixed expenses, you're adding a need for more contribution profit to pay for them. And if you don't already have enough contribution profit to pay for them, the expenses that you're going to add, the business needs to generate more of it by generating more revenue, at least as efficiently as it is now, or maybe more efficiently. Again, it's not saying don't do it. It's just saying understand what the outcome needs to be in order for this to not be, a weighted expense in the business that you can't pay for. So let's look at an example along the same lines that we've been working with. $100,000 in fixed expenses inside of a company, with a company that has a 50% variable margin without ad spend. They spent $100,000 in ad budget and with a break-even ROAS of 4. Now you get 10% additional fixed expenses on that. You hire a new person, whatever that is, that $100,000 goes to $110,000. And break-even ROAS moves for that company from 4 to 4.2. Now that's a 5% performance increase that just has to materialize. Marketing just has to produce a 5% better outcome in order to pay for that person. If you add 20% fixed expenses to that business, it goes to 4.4. That's a 10% increase in performance just to stay at break even. They're not profitable at this point. If you add 30% more fixed expenses to the business, that break even ROAS goes up to 4.6. That's a 15% performance increase that has to just, again, materialize. So that, or you have to increase ad budget in order to bring that needed return on ad spend down. So you have to put more ad capital at risk to pay for that, which is, again, that's fine if you have to do it. If you want to do it, just know ahead of time. So, this happened to us at BottleKeeper in 2019. After our absolutely best year of the company at the time, it was after Shark Tank. 2018, we crushed. We absolutely printed money. At least for us and our small team, it was amazing. I felt that the business could go and support adding additional payroll and adding an additional amazing office and all of this overhead. And the reality is, adding those things into the business materially changed how we operated. It took us from very lean and scrappy and crafty to kind of heavy. And I loved the people. They were incredible. But every fixed dollar of expense I added into the business added weight, and it completely changed how we operated. The result of which is I ended up having to give all the profit that we made in 2018, I gave it back in 2019, and I had to fire those people and I had to get rid of the cool office. So the expenses, the fixed expenses, add something to the business that is not just financial. And it's important that we think about that. And the way that I would think about this, the way that I do think about this, is that every dollar of fixed expense you add to the business takes that dollar away from your net profit. And in addition to that, every dollar of fixed expense that you add raises the bar your marketing has to clear in order to accomplish the goals, and that bar compounds really fast. As we think about these fixed expenses, if you're in a business that is operating at a really high return on ad spend, like an 8 or a 9, that sounds incredible, but you're still not making money or having a hard time get to break even. There are a couple of reasons this can happen. The first is to look at the fixed expenses. What it might mean is that you're actually underfunding the budget, and the result of which is, even at a really high return, you're not creating enough contribution profit to pay for the fixed expenses. So we either need to bring down the fixed expenses, which is probably a good idea, or we need to increase our ad budget, let the return on ad spend come down so that we get to that balance where we're adding enough contribution profit to pay for the fixed expenses. Now, generally speaking, we want to be doing both. We want to be keeping control of our fixed expenses, keeping them as low relative to revenue as humanly possible, try to get them under 20%, the lower the better, while simultaneously driving more contribution profit. That is the winning calculus in the net profit equation. More contribution profit, less fixed expenses. So at this point, we have a full framework. We have the profit pyramid. We have the 4 expense buckets or profit pillars that make up the foundation of that pyramid. We have the magic metric in contribution profit. We have the 5 levers. We've got 3 huge mistakes to avoid. Now let's talk about what actually using all of this looks like in practice. There's a visual that ties the ad budget and math together, and I mentioned this briefly earlier. When you plot the relationship between ad budget and required ROAS in order to create a specific profit outcome, it follows this really interesting curve. It's called a negative log curve. As ad budget goes up, which is on the x-axis, the needed return on ad spend comes down. That's the y-axis. The curve drops steeply at first, and then it flattens out as the budget increases. This happens because we get closer to that variable margin without ad spend, which mathematically we can't go below. Again, this is called a negative log curve. That's not super important, but I also just like to call it an upside down hockey stick. I'll show you an example of exactly what this looks like inside of Pentane's guidance system for reference. And what this visual tells you, practically speaking, is that all of these levers are interconnected. The ad budget and the required ROAS are not independent variables. They are directly tied to each other. Moving one changes the other. Moving anything else like pricing, fixed expenses, discounts, all of these things, the amount of ad budget, it changes the entire system and what it produces in your net profit goal that you are setting. So the system will show you no-go zones, the red places to stay away from, where the floor is. And again, knowing these things before you go and make the decisions is incredibly powerful. Now, once you have all of this framework in place, whether it's through Pentane or through your own version of epic novel spreadsheets, contribution profit is what becomes the thing you monitor very, very closely on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. Now, daily gets a little bit, what I say, myopic or nearsighted. It's nice to look at, it's not super helpful. We want to look at the trends. We want to track it over time, and we need to put a trend line on it so we can see if the things that we're doing are adding contribution profit or they're taking it away. And again, don't nitpick the individual days. As you see days that go way up or days that go way down, they're interesting to look at and maybe try to figure out why. Did we have an influencer do something on a specific day that maybe we can replicate? Those things are good to look at, but you need to zoom out a little bit, get into week over week, up to a month and even beyond that to look at what that trend line is doing. We want to see a trend line that's going up over time. And to be clear, on those days where you see your contribution profit dip below 0, what that technically means is that on that day, the business spent more to earn $1 than the dollar was worth. So we want to keep those to an absolute minimum. They're going to happen. Lord knows they happen to us at BottleKeeper a lot. We would have months of that, but we want to try to minimize them as much as humanly possible. What you're, again, watching for overall is the slope of this trend line. Steep slope going up, really good. Steep slope going down, holy cow, something is on fire. So we need to be really, really aggressive about pulling other levers in the business if we start to see that trend line invert, and particularly invert in a really steep trend. And you should look at these things in and around dates that you make changes within the business. If you are going to test a 10% price increase on May 15th, in Pentane, there's a place where you log this so we can keep track of it. Again, if you're doing it in spreadsheets yourself, that's totally fine. Look at that date forward, maybe go a week before it, and look at that date over the subsequent weeks, contribution profit, and put a trend line on it. That answers the question. Now, there are other variables that could be going on depending seasonally, so we need to be conscious of that. But for the most part, the answer to the question, is that price increase good or bad over time? Is the trend line increasing from that change, or is it decreasing from that change? It is the most crystal clear answer to the question that we can create on what is good or bad for the business. The brands that actually make it to 8 figures are the ones that understand their numbers, generally speaking. They understand them well enough to make confident decisions around ad budget and the impact of hiring and discounts and these things. Now, I've seen some 8-figure businesses that don't understand this, so making kind of a blanket statement here. But generally speaking, they have a fairly good understanding of the math and the structure, or they have a tool or system in place that helps them understand that. They know how much contribution profit they're required to hit their goals. They have realistic ad budgets. They have really healthy margins, meaning that variable margin is low. I mean, I've seen as low as 25%, which is incredible. They have a really low fixed cost ratio, which means the percent of fixed expenses relative to their revenue are low. These are really important leading indicators on how profitable a business can be. Again, I would say try to get that to at or below 20%, because if we keep those fixed costs really low, it takes all of the pressure off our customer acquisition. It's just that much less contribution profit we have to earn in order to pay for them. At BottleKeeper, the things that allowed us to earn 8 figures in revenue on an annual basis with a really, really small team are not the things that were super sexy. Our gross margins were really high. They were 85%. That's incredible. Our fixed expenses were insanely low. That meant that per order, we could afford a lot to acquire a customer. So we spent a ton acquiring customers as we scaled into the business and into the 8 figures. And we could afford to do it because we had that space. And because of that space, we were able to just reinvest heavily in more inventory and more customer acquisition. It was these are the core reasons we were able to grow the way that we did. Again, fixed expenses were low, but we also had layered on top of all of this, a really significant financial model that we wrote to answer questions that I needed to have access to as both the CEO and the person spending all of our advertising dollars. So we built spreadsheets to tell us a story, to answer questions that I had about how to operate a business profitably that needed to be profitable. We didn't have investors. We didn't want to have investors. And I have investors now. Like, I'm not saying that you should never do it, but it was the underlying math and the way that company was structured that allowed us to achieve that outcome. So as we're thinking about things like gross margins, which is what's left after your cost of goods sold, generally, and there's 2 real camps to look at this depending on how your accounting is done, but we'll keep the simple version. The cost of goods sold landed to your fulfillment center. That amount of money, your gross margin, in our case, it was about 85%, which means 85 cents of every dollar was left after we paid for those expenses. Because that was high and because our fixed expenses were so low, we had a lot of contribution profit left after we paid for our fixed expenses. And that's what allowed us to reinvest in the business. Those are the dollars that we used to buy more inventory, to buy more cost of goods sold, to spend more on cost of goods sold, to spend more on customer acquisition and advertising. So think of it like this. High gross margins mean more contribution profit per order. Low fixed expenses mean more of that contribution profit drops into your net profit bucket. Net profit allows you to go back and buy more inventory and pay for more advertising. And more advertising at healthy margins drives more revenue profitably. It just creates this cycle. And it's that cycle that allows you to scale into the 8 figures. It's not overly complicated, but I do appreciate there is complexity in executing in these things, but they are critical. This is the foundation for how to build into millions and millions of dollars in revenue in a way that is profitable and healthy. So to make this as easy as possible for you, here's where we want to start. First, go and calculate your variable margin without advertising. Add up all your sales related expenses. If you have a question about whether or not an expense is variable or not, ask yourself, does this number go up if I make more money, or does it go down if I make less money? And I'm not saying if you go from $1 million to 10 million in revenue, or you need to hire more people. I mean, maybe, but those are not variable expenses. Those are fixed expenses. If I make more money this month, does this number go up? Does it go down? And if the answer to that is yes, it will go up or down, depending on whether we make more money or less money, it's a variable expense. If you pay it regardless, if your revenue went to 0, you still pay for this expense, it is a fixed expense. This is different than the way your accountant will look at it. If it's an advertising expense, Meta, TikTok, Google, all the things that you can ramp up or down quickly within a day or 2, put those in an advertising bucket. We really want to understand your variable margin without advertising expenses. So take the variable expenses and divide it by your revenue. That will give you your variable margin without ads. If that number is under 40%, you're in a reasonably healthy position. We want it to be as low as humanly possible. If it's between 40 to 55, 60%, that's okay. Again, we want it to be closer to 40 as much as we can. That allows for your break-even ROAS to come down. If it's nearing 60% or above 60%, we get into this real danger zone because advertising profitably just gets fantastically difficult. We get into the point where like break-even ROAS, not even covering fixed expenses, is 2.5. So after the variable margin, we want to look at the fixed expenses. All those other operating expenses, add that number up. Understand your fixed cost ratio. Take that number and divide it by your revenue. So then multiply it times 100 to make it a percent. We want that percent to be under 20% if we can help it. If you do that and it's at 50%, but you're in a growth phase, like you just have to take this relative to your own business. Just know that the lower that percent is, the easier it is for your business to get to, just crushing net profit dollars. And once we have that fixed expense amount, and once we have the variable margin without ad spend, we can then use that to calculate where our break-even ROAS is at a given advertising dollar. For example, if the variable margin is 50%, and those fixed costs are $100,000, if you decide that you're going to spend $25,000 in ad budget, the business needs to generate $100,000 in contribution profit to cover the $100,000 of fixed expenses. But 50 cents of every dollar is going to variable expenses. So that business needs to generate $400,000 in revenue on $25,000 in ad spend. So if you're in that business that has $100,000 in fixed expenses, that and a 50% variable margin without advertising spend, in order for that company to get to break even at a 4 return on ad spend, they have to spend $100,000 in advertising. Now, again, the way that math works is that 50% of every dollar we earn is going to fixed expenses. So from that $400,000, half of that is gone to cost of goods, shipping, fulfillment, all that. So we have $200,000 left. $100,000 of that has to cover the fixed expenses. And it's the remaining 100,000 that goes to advertising expense. So that's just the break even. If you want to generate net profit, that's a totally different, we need to add into that additional contribution profit that remains after the fixed expenses. So I hope this does not make it more complex. Pentane does all this stuff very simply for you, but I do want to be able to provide you with at least some guidance on how to do the math if it is something you want to try to figure out on your own. So if you want a system that does all of these things for you, that's exactly what Pentane was built to do, which leaves you with two options. You can take what you've learned in this course and work on building it yourself into spreadsheets and vibe coding dashboards and things like that, which is entirely up to you, or you can let Pentane handle it for you. That's what we built this thing to do, with all the underlying math and structure that is not done by AI, which is really important. So you can let Pentane do all this for you automatically by clicking the first link in the description. It connects your QuickBooks or your Xero or wherever you're accounting and your revenue, Shopify, Amazon, all those things, and your advertising platforms, and it just automatically calculates contribution profit over time. It shows you that negative log curve and does all the math for you, just gives you the answers to the questions, tells you where your break-even ROAS is at any budget. It tells you, as you put in your net profit goal, what you need to do, how the business needs to perform to achieve, and how that changes as you add discounts or play with prices or hire people or fire people. And there's not really a lot of risk because, frankly, if you don't like it in the first month, we're going to give you your money back. It's really inexpensive, which I did intentionally to help as many early stage e-com operators as I possibly can. And again, worst case, you'll have a dramatically better picture of your business and what is good and what is bad and where there are opportunities to improve. So again, you can find Pentane by clicking the first link in the description. And with that, thank you for joining me on this adventure, and I will see you next time.